Hello, my dear masterminds. They thought they were ready. That's the part they're still trying to understand. They didn't underestimate you. They didn't ignore you. They didn't act careless or sloppy. They planned. They anticipated. They ran scenarios in their heads where you reacted emotionally, defensively, intensely, strategically. They prepared responses for anger, explanations for confusion, countermeasures for resistance. They assumed one thing without realizing it, that you would react at all. Their entire preparation depended on motion, on stimulus and response, on pressure-producing output. That's how most systems work. You apply pressure and wait for movement. You provoke and observe. You escalate and collect data. That's the loop they expected you to enter. But you didn't. And the moment you didn't respond the way the model predicted, the model failed internally, quietly. Because systems don't panic when something breaks. People do. The first thing they noticed wasn't fear, it was confusion. The kind that doesn't show on the face but disrupts timing. Conversations slowed. Follow-ups hesitated. People paused mid-thought, as if waiting for a cue that never arrived. They had prepared for reactions that signal position. Resistance means opposition. Compliance means leverage. Emotion means access. You offered none of it. You didn't resist. You didn't comply. You didn't perform calm as a tactic. You simply didn't give them what they built for. And when preparation meets emptiness, all that effort has nowhere to land. They tried again, subtle this time, adjusted tone, different angle, new pressure point, still nothing usable. That's when they realized the issue wasn't misreading you. It was that you weren't playing a role that allowed interpretation at all. Prediction requires pattern. You didn't supply one. Your response wasn't delayed to create mystery. It wasn't immediate to assert control. It arrived exactly when it needed to, stripped of excess, carrying no emotional residue they could work with. That precision creates more uncertainty than overt confrontation ever could. Confrontation confirms engagement. Silence confirms independence. They prepared for reactions because reactions create openings. You gave them an outcome without an opening. And that's the response they never accounted for. Once they realized the preparation wasn't working, they did what people always do when influence slips. They increased observation, watched for micro-expressions, read between pauses, overanalyzed tone, posture, timing. They assumed the response must be hidden somewhere, that it would surface if they watched closely enough. That assumption exposed the flaw. They believed every human response leaves residue, tells, signals. You didn't. Not because you were masking, but because there was nothing to conceal. You weren't managing an image. You weren't holding a position that required defense. You weren't waiting to see how things landed. You had already landed. That's what made their analysis useless. Analysis depends on instability. It needs fluctuation to extract meaning. You remained steady. And steadiness breaks prediction faster than chaos ever could. They tried to frame your behavior as strategy. Because strategy implies intent, they can counter. But the longer they watched, the harder that became. Strategy adapts. It adjusts when pressure changes. You didn't adjust. You remained aligned. That forced a reclassification they weren't prepared for. If this wasn't strategy, then it wasn't opposition either. And without opposition, there was nothing to apply. Their planning assumed interaction. You removed interaction without withdrawing. You stayed present, but unavailable to manipulation. That combination alters the existing structure because systems rely on response. Influence needs reaction to measure itself. Direction needs feedback to confirm momentum. You gave neither. So the structure paused, not challenged, not overturned, just paused. And most systems aren't designed for that. You held position without asserting it. And when someone holds position without announcing it, everyone else begins recalculating where they stand. That recalibration is where their confidence started to fade. Not because you intimidated them, but because their tools stopped producing results. Every framework they relied on assumed participation. Influence assumes engagement. Pressure assumes resistance. Incentives assume desire. You supplied none of it. You weren't detached. You were complete. And completeness can't be interpreted by systems built on extraction. They kept waiting for a move they could answer, a signal they could respond to, a reaction they could catalog and neutralize. It never came. Instead, what appeared was consistency. Not the rigid kind that performs discipline, but the quiet kind that doesn't fluctuate under observation. You didn't mirror energy. You didn't escalate tone. You didn't soften to be liked or harden to be respected. You stayed exact. That's when the preparation turned against them. All those scenarios they rehearsed became excess weight. Plans without a point of contact lose relevance immediately. They prepared for every possible reaction and discovered that reaction itself was the wrong assumption. Your response wasn't outside expectation. It existed beyond the framework entirely. That realization spread faster than they anticipated. Not through conversation, but through hesitation. People began checking with each other before acting, delaying decisions they would normally rush, measuring words they once used casually. Because when someone doesn't respond the way authority expects, timing slips, and timing is everything. You didn't take control, you removed their rhythm. Once rhythm fades, authority begins to sound like noise. They weren't dealing with opposition, they were dealing with an absence they couldn't fill. And that absence disrupted their preparation more effectively than confrontation ever could. That's when they realized something else they hadn't prepared for. You weren't unpredictable. Unpredictability still operates within known limits. What you introduced was something else entirely. Non-participation without disengagement. You stayed present, but declined the exchange. That placed them in the position they avoid most. Acting without feedback. Every system relies on response to validate its next step. Without response, certainty erodes. They questioned whether to advance or pause. Every option felt unstable because none of them produced clarity. You weren't blocking access. You were removing reference points. Not to gain advantage, but because nothing needed to be exchanged. And reference points are how influence explains itself. You didn't argue. You didn't defend. You didn't correct assumptions. You allowed projections to remain unanswered. That's when discomfort appeared, because when response is absent, uncertainty fills the space, and uncertainty causes people to reveal intent too early. They began explaining more than necessary, committing prematurely, trying to draw something they could respond to. That's where balance shifted, not because you changed, but because they did. Their need for response exposed itself. You remained still, and stillness under observation isn't passivity, it's placement. You weren't waiting to see what they'd do. You were watching how dependent they were on reaction. And once that dependence became visible, outcomes no longer required discussion. From there, their actions began undermining their own position. Preparation only functions when the other side behaves as expected. They kept adjusting approaches, not realizing each adjustment revealed reliance. Each shift highlighted how much they needed your response for coherence. You didn't oppose them. You didn't confront them. You allowed contrast to form naturally, and that contrast became visible to everyone paying attention. Your response wasn't silence for effect. It was completion. The kind that settles a space without announcement. They weren't interacting with restraint. They were encountering someone who didn't need to choose anymore. And that distinction was missing from every scenario they prepared. Choice suggests tension. Tension suggests leverage. You had neither. You weren't withholding, you had already moved past the point where reaction mattered. That's why their preparation looked impressive on paper and ineffective in reality. It assumed access that no longer existed. By the time that became clear, the situation had already shifted. Not through force, through alignment. They prepared for reactions because they believed reactions shape outcomes. You offered something else entirely, a settled state. And settled states don't respond to pressure. They make it irrelevant. That's when the aftermath began. Quiet, unannounced, but lasting. People stopped referring to their preparation as if it still applied. Plans don't survive contact with a reality they can't influence. They don't collapse dramatically. They fade. Conversations that once centered on control shifted toward reassessment, not because anything erupted, but because nothing landed. There was no clear mistake to point to, no obvious misstep to correct. The preparation itself was sound. The execution was clean, and yet the outcome moved past them anyway. That's what unsettled them most. An outcome without a visible cause, a shift without confrontation. They reviewed the sequence again, this time with a different lens, not looking for what you did, but for what you declined to do. Every moment they expected engagement and received steadiness, instead formed a pattern they couldn't ignore. You didn't override their preparation by thinking faster. You made it unnecessary by not entering the exchange it required. And once that realization settles in, frustration doesn't appear. Caution does. They stop assuming reactions. They stop planning around predictable behavior. Because now they understand someone in the room doesn't operate from that axis anymore. You didn't succeed by playing better. You stood where preparation no longer applied. That's the part that stays with them. Long after the moment passes, long after preparation is forgotten, they remember the realization more than the event itself, the understanding that influence doesn't always appear as action. Sometimes it appears as absence, as the refusal to provide friction where friction is required for systems to function. They prepared for reactions because reactions keep processes alive. You allowed the process to end by not feeding it. And that result doesn't invite retaliation or escalation. It invites adjustment. People modify how they approach you without ever explaining why. They choose words more carefully. They pause before applying pressure. They stop assuming access. Not because you warned them, but because they learned. They learned that not every challenge is met directly. Some are simply out of range. Your response wasn't clever, it was complete. It didn't seek advantage. It revealed that advantage had already shifted. And once that's understood, preparation loses relevance. You can't prepare for someone who isn't responding to the same signals. They accounted for every possible reaction and encountered the one condition no plan includes: someone who doesn't need to respond to remain settled. That's where everything changed, and it doesn't revert. What remains isn't tension, it's recalibration. Long after the exchange ends, people notice themselves adjusting in ways they don't fully understand. They hesitate before projecting certainty. They reconsider assumptions that once felt automatic, because somewhere in their understanding, an expectation shifted. They learned that preparation only works when both sides agree to participate in the same exchange. You didn't. And that refusal didn't come from defiance or performance. It came from internal alignment, so complete that response became optional. That's why they don't describe what happened as a loss. Loss suggests competition. This felt like discovery, an uncomfortable one. They realized that influence doesn't always come from pressure. Sometimes it comes from position so settled, it doesn't need reinforcement. They won't say it openly, but they know now. The most unsettling presence in any space isn't the loudest or the fastest. It's the one that remains still when movement is expected. The one that doesn't react when reaction is assumed. Preparation fails there. Not because it was weak, but because it was aimed at something that no longer exists. And once that understanding settles, it doesn't trigger another attempt. It alters behavior. They don't prepare harder next time. They prepare differently, with more care, with less noise, because they've learned the cost of expecting reactions from someone who no longer needs to provide them. And the lasting change is this: they stop trying to interpret you and start adjusting around you, not out of fear, out of recognition. Recognition that whatever guides your decisions isn't reactive, isn't negotiable, isn't pulled by pressure or reward. It's already resolved. That's why your response didn't look dramatic in the moment. It didn't need to be dramatic. It quietly set a new reference for what steadiness looks like when it isn't performing for approval. People adjusted their timing. Their language tightened. Their assumptions thinned out. They stopped expecting outcomes to be provoked and started respecting limits that were never announced. You didn't teach a lesson. You revealed a boundary. And boundaries that reveal themselves without force invite adjustment, not challenge. That's why nothing followed this moment. No rematch, no escalation, no attempt to reclaim direction. The situation resolved itself. Because once someone realizes their preparation depended on your response, and your response was never required, there's nothing left to prepare for. Expectations dissolve. Momentum dissipates. What remains is the quiet understanding that some people don't respond because they don't need to. They were already positioned where outcomes don't ask permission. That's the part they didn't anticipate. And it's the part that stays after that. The environment doesn't return to its previous shape. Not because you reshaped it deliberately, but because it now carries a different reference. People stop assuming reactions are guaranteed. They stop confusing composure with compliance. They stop believing preparation equals control. Something fundamental adjusts. The focus shifts from who can apply the most pressure to who remains unaffected by it. And in that quiet shift, Your presence becomes a reference without needing to be named. You aren't treated as unpredictable. You're treated as settled. There's a difference. Uncertainty invites testing. Settled presence ends it. They don't try to outmaneuver you next time. They don't rehearse new scripts. They adjust expectations before you arrive. That's the outcome they never planned for. Not a win. Not a loss. A redefinition. You didn't give them a response to analyze. You gave them a condition to adapt to. And conditions don't debate. They persist. That's why this doesn't turn into drama or retaliation. It settles into behavior, into pacing, into restraint, into silence where noise once worked. Preparation fades when it realizes it was aimed at a reality that no longer applies. What remains is the quiet recognition that the most decisive presence isn't always an answer. Sometimes it's the absence that closes the question entirely. What's rarely stated is that this shifted how they measure strength, not in theory, in behavior. They stop mistaking preparation for mastery and stop assuming anticipation equals control, because they learned something directly. Preparation only matters when it meets a receptive surface. You weren't a surface. You were a limit. And limits don't react. They define. After this, people grow quieter, around moments that matter. They listen more than they speak. They hesitate before trying to steer outcomes. Not because they fear you, but because they're more aware of themselves. Aware that reaction is a resource, and resources can be wasted. You didn't withhold response to gain advantage. You withheld it because nothing needed to be added. The moment had already resolved itself. That's the difference they carry forward. The difference between managing situations and existing in a way that settles them. They prepared for every possible reaction because they believed reactions were unavoidable. You showed them something rarer, that even expectation itself isn't guaranteed. And once that understanding arrives, it doesn't inspire imitation. It inspires restraint. People don't try to become you. They become more deliberate around those who don't need movement to remain steady. That's the effect that lasts beyond the moment. Not attention, not recognition, orientation. The environment learns where stillness holds, and it adjusts before anything has to happen. The understanding settles quietly. They stop preparing for you. Not because they surrendered, but because preparation no longer fits. You aren't a variable to account for. You're a constant others move around. That's where it concludes. No acknowledgement, no display. Just a lasting change in how situations resolve when you're present. People learn that pressure doesn't draw you closer. Incentives don't redirect you. Provocation doesn't create motion. What works elsewhere simply doesn't register here. And once that's learned, behavior changes upstream, before words are chosen, before strategies are formed, before plans are set. They don't wait to see how you'll react because they already know. You won't provide what they prepared for. Not because you're withholding, because there's nothing required. The moment doesn't ask for it. You aren't opposing. You aren't complying. You're settled. And settled states don't fluctuate to satisfy expectation. That's why this never escalates into spectacle. It closes itself. Quietly. Lastingly. They prepared for every possible reaction and learned the one thing preparation can't handle. Someone who doesn't need to respond to remain grounded. That's the final line they learn to read. And once they read it, the environment adjusts before you ever need to speak.